Welcome to Ag Marketing IQ In Depth. We're here today with David Widmar. He has long been a source for farm futures and a valued resource for farmers across this country. Today, unfortunately, David has the unenviable position of talking to us about fertilizer prices, and we'll start with where those are, and then we'll go into what you can do to control those. So, David, go ahead and lay it on us. Where are fertilizer prices going?
Well, thank you, Pam. It's been up, and it's been up since the spring. It's been up over the last couple of weeks. It's been up on a year-over-year basis. We track over time the application or the product cost for a corn fertilizer blend of 180, 70, 70. Right now, it's coming in at $170 per acre. That's up from 162 back in the spring. It was around 145 last fall. But there's a lot of ways you can slice that, right? It's a lot less than we saw back in 2022 at 270. When you look at the data over time, it's this story that I think a lot of producers are resonating with, is that it used to be 160 was the high, right? That was back in that 2011, 12, 13 era. And now we're at 160 to 170 the last couple of years, and that feels like the low. And so the highs are now the lows, and that's a big frustration. We're watching it as a percent of the budget. We've seen fertilizer expense get above 25% of budgeted corn revenue in Indiana on a few occasions. But what's unique here is that we've been persistently and stubbornly above 20% over the last few years. The last couple of years, it's been 24% average. If you go back before 2022, 2010, 2022, it was an average of 19%. So it's a lot more bushels of our budget are being allocated to fertilizer today than we saw just a few years ago.
So ideally, a producer wants to look, we talked a lot about, know your break even. So when a producer is looking at that, what can he do to decrease the percentage of his budget that goes to fertilizer?
Well, I think a lot of us hope that we get more bushels or more price. And unfortunately, hope isn't a strategy, and that could be a favorable outcome. But we have to untangle the quality of decisions we make from the outcome that we get. And so I think a lot of producers who are looking into 2026, looking at these high fertilizer prices and this high fertilizer expense, should spend some time decomposing the source of that. And so when we look at the data, we see some products are up a lot. So if you look at liquid 28% or liquid 32%, they're up 25 to 50% year over year. On the other hand, we see in hydrous and urea, they're up a smaller percentage on a year over year basis. And hydrous is only up about 1% from the spring. That's kind of the smallest gains that we have seen. I think also when you look at P and K, the sources have also mattered there as well. So think about the sources. Part two is think about what you really need. And I think one of the ways that you can think about this is on P and K, there's some banking opportunities, and maybe you've built up your fertility levels in your soils, and maybe now is the time you can do some testing, some soil testing, to make sure you have adequate levels and that you know where your yield goals are, and you're going to be able to get there with those yield goals. And so I think the ROI, the return on investment in 2026 for a precision fertilizer grid sample is going to be the highest that we might have seen throughout our careers. If there's an ample soil, if there's ample fertility in the soil, this might be the year to use that and to help get our budgets back to profitability.
And that's one of the things when we look at, not only you're looking at your grid sample, then how do you apply it? So when you put it out there, it's hard for a farmer to say, okay, maybe I can put none here and put more over there and come out ahead. How do you get your head around that when you're a farmer wanting to hit those high yield goals?
Yes, I think that's where this idea of the precision sampling, precision application really comes in, and it starts to resonate. And I think if you take a long run approach to this, you could probably put a set it and forget it type fertility program together over several years, especially if you have a pretty predictable crop rotation and you can get away with some of the cheaper sampling and the cheaper applications. But this is an environment where we have really high nutrient costs, really low commodity prices, where we might want to step back and say, okay, I want to make sure I'm not over fertilizing in one area of the field. I want to make sure I'm not under fertilizing in another part of the field. So if we haven't done fertility tests over the last few years, if you haven't done these precisions, this might be that time, because again, that ROI can be really high there. That allows us to dial in what we actually apply and make sure we get what we need into the fields to make sure we don't have yield losses. I think the other temptation here, Pam, and it's a troubling one, is that there's sort of, it's like the bank, right? So we all have our bank accounts, and we all know that we want to keep a healthy balance in here, and we get comfortable at one threshold. And so precision is the idea of this precision application or sampling is like, okay, we have above adequate, right? We're in this surplus area, so we might hold back and we might get these samples back down to adequate. I think the other temptation for producers is to not soil sample and just say, oh, my back of the math envelope says I haven't had that good of yields. I've been over applying the last few years. I'm just going to cut back P&K and not do that soil test. And that's the recipe for a risk. That's a lot of agronomic risk. When you think about, we're kind of shooting in the dark here, and we don't want to make a decision today that leaves us disappointed next fall when we're in the combine saying, why didn't I get the yields that I was planning on or hoping for or in marketing for? And it's, the question comes down to, we had an inadequate P&K program, and our soil samples weren't adequate. They weren't above adequate. They were adequate or below adequate, and then we held back on P&K.
And that's your standard. You got to spend money to make money. But in this case, it's also you're spending money to ultimately save money. I mean, that's an argument I make with my husband all the time when I go shopping, but he doesn't buy
it. Well, I think with producers, we have to be very careful of those variable expenses, right? Because if you hurt yourself agronomically, you do put yourself behind that 8 ball. And I think it's a warning shot that we've all heard of. It's something we've all seen our neighbors do, but I think it's something that none of us want to admit to doing ourselves. It's this idea that we went cheap on something, on a per acre basis.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we picked the cheap fertility program, the cheap crop protection program, the cheap fungicide or the seeding program,
Mm-hmm.
and it cost us when it comes to yield. So that's why you really have to think about not just dollars per acre of expense, but the yield implications. And a lot of times that brings us to a conversation of dollars per bushel. And again, the idea here is if you're going to put a program together that's going to reduce your yield, it could raise your cost per bushel.
So when you're looking at that, we're seeing variable costs with a wide range across farmers. So a lot of times we see extension budget comes out and it says the prices we're getting here are higher than our break even. Does that break even apply to every farmer out there?
Well, so there's a joke out there, Pam. I don't know if you've heard it. A farmer got frustrated and told his accountant, his banker, and his favorite economist to give him his break even, tell him what his cost per bushel was. But they had to come up with the same number. He locked him in his office, and no one has seen either of them since. And the idea here is that your banker, your accountant, and your economist are going to tell you your break even is different. And that's really frustrating for producers. It leads us to all say, well, farmers don't know their cost of production. Well, we're all counting it in a different way. So university crop budgets, I think they're one of the best things that were ever created, and also one of the worst things that were ever created. Mm-hmm. But they're an economic cost. And what does economic cost mean? It means full cost. So we're paying a cash rent for every acre farm. We're paying a return on equipment. We're paying a return to labor and management. And so if a farmer breaks even economically, their balance sheet's probably growing. They're generating a tax bill. So their economic break even means we've already paid a return to the land. We're not making excess returns. And so it's really important to keep that in mind, especially on the fixed costs. I think university budgets are great on variable costs. They get tricky in this fixed cost. So how might a producer be different? I think the example of, do you own the land? Do you rent the land? Or are you paying debt payments on that land? And this gets this idea of a tax break even versus a cash flow break even. And so if you are making payments on land, maybe land that you just purchased, you can have a really high cash cost, but your accounting cost is going to be really low. You can't write off those payments to Uncle Sam. And so you have a situation where you need to generate profits and you have to pay taxes to make enough income to cash flow those payments, to cash flow all those
Mhm.
other obligations. And so every producer is going to have a different situation and a different set of circumstances. And so I think those university budgets are really great for the long term. They're really great to benchmark yourself against, but don't use those as your first and final starting point. Dial it in and make sure you know what your break-even costs are on an accounting basis, break-even costs are on a cash flow basis, because they're going to be different and it's going to change over time.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Don't just plug that university number in. Fabulous benchmark. I'm a huge fan of Extension for all that they have done to help farmers to figure out where they're at and where they're going and ways to get there. So that's the other question for you today. And the final question, David, what's the best answer for a farmer? You've said no break even, and maybe get that percentage down on the other variable costs because we're not going to get them down on fertilizer. I mean, eh, have we kind of changed from this is the percentage goes to nutrients and fertilizer, and this is the percentage that goes to that? Do we need to adjust some of our other thinking?
Well, I think we have to first think about what are the things that we can control. We cannot control the price of fertilizer. Maybe we can get a 4 or 5% discount relative to the posted price, or maybe we get a 4 or 5% difference compared to our neighbors. That could be important, that could be significant, but that's probably not going to be enough to get us back to profitability. So, Pam, the other point was we got to tackle all those variable costs, and that's another part of the category. One of the things that we've been watching that we're a little concerned about is total variable costs are going up over time. And so we have more variable costs in the production system today than we've had at other points in history. And that adds more risk. That's called operating leverage. And so it takes more dollars for us to get to a break even or situation. So one of the things that we're telling producers also is know those fixed costs. You can't get a price sheet for those fixed costs. You can't benchmark those fixed costs very easily. But I tell you what, you can get a 10 or 15 or 20% difference between what your fixed costs are and your neighbor's fixed costs, or your
Mhm.
fixed costs next year compared to your fixed costs a couple of years ago. And so we really have to zero in on those fixed costs. That is the bucket that producers have a lot of control over. And it's frankly an emotionally difficult bucket to tackle.
Mhm.
Family living's in there, farmland debt payments are in there, machinery is in there. These are
Mhm.
kind of where all the skeletons in our financial budget tend to accumulate. But if we're going to get serious about getting our costs under control, we have to tackle the fixed category.
I see that as exactly where farmers need to go. And I was just thinking while you were talking that it's another one of the areas where farmers and journalists are a lot alike. We prefer being outside and doing the job to doing the paperwork and the numbers. And it sounds like everyone needs to really sharpen those pencils this year.
Yeah, nobody gets into the farming business or the ranching business to do budgets, right? To work on Excel projections and reading financial ratios. But ultimately, that's the work, that's the effort that gets you, that allows you to stay in the business. And I think if we can think about it that way, and that's the way we're going to create differentiation between us today versus us in 10 years, it's going to keep differentiation between us and our peers. And how can we make sure that we're that low cost producer? And how do we make sure we keep making progress towards our family and personal and professional goals?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. I think you gave farmers a lot to look at and to focus on and to help them be successful in 2026 and beyond. So, welcome to Ag Marketing IQ in Depth, and we hope to have you back again on this show.
Thanks so much, Pam.